welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into EU-US relations. Things have been a little, well, interesting, shall we say, since Donald Trump got back in the White House.
Oh, yeah.
We found this Euronews article about a phone call between, the EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, and the new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. It's actually their first conversation since Trump's inauguration. So we're going to unpack what this call tells us about the state of things, especially with all that's going on with the war in Ukraine and Trump's unique approach to Greenland.
Right. Trump's idea about buying Greenland.
Exactly. So,
well, the thing that really struck me was the timing of this call. It wasn't exactly, a top priority for the new administration. I mean, Rubio had already spoken to a whole bunch of other world leaders before he even, got around to Kallas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The EU's not exactly a small player on the world stage, right?
Right.
So why the delay? I mean, is this like a sign that Trump's maybe, shifting away from that traditional transatlantic alliance? Or is he just trying to keep everyone guessing?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely raises some eyebrows. Remember, back during his campaign, Trump really pushed that America First idea.
Yeah.
And he even talked about, rethinking some of those long-standing alliances. So this delay, I mean, it could be a way of, signaling that he's serious about shaking things up a little.
So reading between the lines a little, it sounds like this call was maybe more about, establishing a new pecking order rather than, reaffirming those old partnerships. But let's actually dive into the content of the call itself. So they talked about the war in Ukraine, right?
They did, yeah. And it seems like they're pretty much on the same page about keeping the pressure on Russia. The article mentions a shared commitment to a, quote, just and sustainable peace, end quote, which is interesting, especially when consider some of the things Trump has said in the past about, wanting to end the war quickly.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. During the campaign, he was all about, making a deal with Putin. But then later he admitted it wouldn't be that, that simple. So what's the strategy here? Is this maximum pressure thing just more of the same? Or is there, a new Trumpian twist to it?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
The EU has already been pretty tough on Russia, with the sanctions. And Rubio, he actually welcomed that during the call. But then you got Trump on the other side, throwing out threats of, even more sanctions if Putin doesn't play ball. It's almost like he's trying to, out-tough the EU on this one. Well, that's classic Trump, isn't it? Always going to be the tough guy, right? Always going to have the upper hand. But speaking of tough guys, didn't Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, and he's a bit of a Trump admirer, isn't he? Didn't he almost block the renewal of those sanctions?
He did, yeah. Orban's he's a fascinating character, to say the least, and his close ties with Russia make him a real wild card in all of this. He did eventually back down, but it does show you, there are some cracks in the EU's, in that united front when it comes to dealing with Moscow.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. If even within the EU there are these, different opinions on how to deal with Russia, well, I mean, it makes it so much harder to present a strong unified front against Putin. And let's be honest, a divided Europe is exactly what Putin wants, right? Oh, absolutely. And this is where, that delay in the Kallas-Rubio call becomes even more, well, significant, I guess you could say. I mean, could it be that the U.S. is, trying to figure out who they can really rely on within the EU? Are they looking for leaders who are more aligned with, with Trump's more hawkish stance on Russia? It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if this whole America First approach might actually, end up weakening the West's position against Russia. But let's shift gears for a second. Let's talk about another potential flashpoint in EU-US relations, Greenland.
Yes. The elephant or maybe the polar bear in the room.
Exactly. So just to catch everyone up, Trump has made it pretty clear that he wants to buy Greenland. He's even hinted that he might be willing to use force to get it. Now, the EU has pushed back pretty hard on that. They vowed to defend the island, which is, part of Denmark. And to make matters even more complicated, there was a recent poll that showed that the vast majority of Greenlanders, they want nothing to do with Trump's plan.
Right. It's a pretty bold move, to say the least. And it's one that has baffled a lot of observers.
Yeah.
Why is Trump so fixated on this, icy island? Is it purely about, strategic interests, or is there something else going on here?
It's a real head scratcher, isn't it? I mean, Greenland's not exactly a tropical paradise.
Right.
So what is it about this place? What's the real motivation here? Is it about resources, military positioning, Or is this just, a billionaire's whim?
It's probably a combination of
Yeah.
factors, to be honest. Greenland does have, some valuable mineral resources, and its location in the Arctic is becoming more and more, well, important as the region opens up because of climate change.
Right.
But then there's also, you got to factor in Trump himself. He's not exactly known for, for subtle diplomacy.
Yeah, that's true. He does seem to like, making these grand attention-grabbing gestures. But, okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The article we're looking at, it doesn't actually say whether Greenland came up in the Kallas-Rubio call. It seems like a pretty big omission, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you've got this major, point of contention between the U.S. and the EU.
Yeah.
And it's just not mentioned. What does that tell us? Are they trying to, are they deliberately avoiding the topic because it's too sensitive, or are they, hashing it out behind closed doors?
Maybe it's a little bit both. Maybe they're trying to downplay the issue publicly while they, work out some kind of compromise behind the scenes. Or maybe Trump's just waiting for the right moment to drop the Greenland bomb again. Who knows with this guy?
I know, right? The lack of transparency, it really just adds to the uncertainty surrounding the whole thing. And it makes you wonder, how much trust there really is between the U.S. and the EU at this point.
That's a good point. If they can't even talk openly about something as, potentially explosive as Greenland, what does that say about their ability to, to cooperate on other issues? Like, let's talk about defense spending, for example. That's always a hot topic in transatlantic relations, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it seems like it's going to be even more contentious under the new Trump administration. Rubio is really pushing for Europe to increase its defense spending, which is a pretty standard U.S. talking point, right? But Trump, I mean, he's taken it a step further. He's demanding that Europe contributes 5% of its GDP to defense.
5%. That's a huge number, and I'm not even sure the U.S. itself meets that target. So how did Kallas respond to that?
Well, she basically said that, Europe is stepping up its defense investments and taking on more responsibility for its own security.
Yeah.
But I doubt that's going to be enough for Trump. He seems determined to shake things up. And pushing Europe to spend more on defense, well, that's one way to do it.
It's like he's trying to turn back the clock to a time when, the U.S. was the undisputed leader of the free world and Europe was just, following along. But the world has changed, right? The EU is a major power in its own right, and it's not going to just, do whatever the U.S. tells it to do.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of, strategic autonomy comes in. The EU, they want to be able to act independently on the world stage. They don't want to have to rely on the U.S. for everything. That doesn't mean abandoning the transatlantic alliance altogether. But it does mean, redefining the terms of that partnership.
So strategic autonomy, it's basically like the EU wants to have its cake and eat it too. They want to, they want to benefit from U.S. military might, but also assert their own independence.
Yeah, in a nutshell, that's pretty much it. And it's a tough balancing act. It requires clear communication, a willingness to compromise, and a shared understanding of, of each other's interests.
Which, based on this phone call, doesn't seem to be, in abundance right now. I mean, we've got agreement on Russia, tension over Greenland, and this ongoing debate about defense spending. It's not exactly a recipe for, a harmonious relationship, is it?
Not really, no. But, we have to remember, this is just one phone call. It's just a snapshot in time. And things could change very quickly.
That's true. That's true. But this call does raise some important questions about the future of transatlantic relations under Trump.
It definitely does.
And those are questions that, that we need to keep asking.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a bit here and talk about what all of this means for, for the average person. Why should they care about these high-level diplomatic maneuvers?
That's a great question. It's easy to, to get caught up in the abstract world of geopolitics and forget that these decisions have, real-world consequences.
Right. It's not just, politicians playing chess on a global scale. It's about people's lives, their livelihoods, their security.
Exactly. And when you look at it from that perspective, the stakes become a lot higher.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, if the U.S. and the EU fail to present a united front against Russia, it could embolden Putin to take even more aggressive actions in Ukraine.
Right. Yeah. And that could have a domino effect, leading to instability in other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
And potentially, drawing NATO into a wider conflict.
Exactly. And on the economic front, a trade war between the U.S. and the EU, which Trump is, he's threatened in the past.
Yeah.
Well, that would have devastating consequences for both sides of the Atlantic. We're talking about, lost jobs, higher prices, and a slowdown in economic growth.
And let's not forget about climate change, which requires, a global cooperation to address effectively. If the U.S. and the EU are at odds, it makes it that much harder to make progress on this, this critical issue.
Oh, absolutely. The challenges facing the world today are they're complex and interconnected. They demand cooperation and collaboration, not division and conflict.
So what you're saying is that, the state of EU-U.S. relations, it has these far-reaching implications that affect, well, everyone, whether they realize it or not.
Exactly. It's not just about, these abstract geopolitical concepts. It's about the very real impact that these relationships have on our lives.
It's like we've gone down this rabbit hole with this one phone call.
Yeah, it really shows you how everything's connected these days. You can't just look at EU-U.S. relations on their own. You got to think about, like, the whole global picture, the personalities, the history, all of it.
And it feels like with Trump back in the mix, well, things are a lot more unpredictable.
Definitely. I mean, he's a total wild card.
Yeah.
And that makes it so hard to, figure out what's going to happen next. Those old rules of diplomacy, they don't seem to apply to him.
Yeah.
Which can be kind of exciting, but also a little unsettling.
Yeah, exciting in that, anything could happen, but unsettling because, well, anything could happen. We could see a complete, breakdown in relations, or maybe some, crazy breakthroughs. It's really tough to know what to expect.
I know. That's what makes it so interesting to try and analyze. We're watching history happen right in front of us.
Yeah.
And it's full of these twists and turns.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's your, final takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about? What's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the main thing is that we're in a whole new era of transatlantic relations. The old playbook, it's out the window. And the stakes are, well, they're higher than ever. The decisions being made now in both Washington and Brussels, they're going to have a huge impact on the world for years to come.
So you're saying we all need to be paying attention, even if we're not, diplomats or politicians?
Absolutely. We all have a stake in this. The future of the EU-U.S. partnership, it affects everything. Global security, economic prosperity, even our ability to tackle climate change. It's not something we can just, ignore.
So what can the average person do besides, listening to great podcasts like this one, of course?
Well, stay informed. Engage in thoughtful discussions. And don't be afraid to ask tough questions. We need to hold our leaders accountable and make sure they're actually acting in our best interests.
That's a great call to action. It reminds us that even in this, crazy world of geopolitics, we all have a role to play. Well, thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into EU-U.S. relations. It's been, it's been fascinating and, as you said, a little unsettling at times.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah.
And to our listeners out there, keep those questions coming. The more we explore these issues, the better prepared we'll be to navigate the uncertain times ahead.